Okay, well, it's 10 after, so we might as well get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to PHL247, Critical Reasoning. I'm very excited that you all could make it. So this is a course about arguments, and the basic idea is that we're going to look very carefully at how arguments work, what makes an argument good, and what makes an argument bad. I'm particularly excited to get to teach this course. I just finished my PhD in philosophy of science at the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, which means most of the courses that I've taught have been either in philosophy of science or history of science. And those are spiritually enlightening topics. They really sort of like give you the broad view of things, but you can't really tell people, oh, this is going to be super useful in your day-to-day life. This course, we actually can say that. This course actually should be, or has a very good chance of being genuinely useful to you in your lives wherever you may end up. So can I get just a show of hands? Who here is in philosophy? Most of you are not. Okay, who here is in some humanities in general, some broadly speaking in humanities? Okay, so not even most of you. And who here is in sciences primarily? A more general. Is anybody in a thing that I didn't just mention? What are you in?
Political science.
Political science, okay, good. Also should be useful there. So wherever you are from and wherever you are going, you're probably going to have to use arguments at some point. So hopefully we can give you, this course will give you the sort of standard toolkit that philosophers have been developing for how to think about arguments, how to analyze them, and how to make good ones. So you already know how to reason. I'm going to be depending on that fact in order to teach you how to use these tools, right? So you have this intuitive sense of what makes an argument good or bad. And I'm going to be doing a lot of showing you an argument and saying, now you can see how that's a good argument, or you can see how that's a bad argument. So we're going to be depending on the fact that you already know, you can already intuitively tell when an argument is good or bad, right? So you're all sort of proficient at this. Presumably you've already had arguments in your life or you've debated with people. So you've already got this skill. And all we're going to be doing here is kind of refining the skill that you already have by giving you the formal tools, but also giving you the language to talk about arguments. So one of the things that happens altogether too much when you're exchanging ideas with somebody is that you're talking past each other, the arguments aren't quite meeting each other properly, and having some of the meta language to talk about arguments can be helpful for you to home in on what's gone wrong. So these are actually tools that are useful for arguing with less confusion, less conflict perhaps. So the main subject of the course, as I said, is arguments, and we have a very specific thing in mind when we talk about arguments in this course. So there's going to be a bunch of cases where I'm going to use extremely common words in a specialized sense. So forget everything that you know about arguments. Arguments are not where two people yell back and forth at each other. In this class, arguments are exactly and only this: when one idea or some set of ideas is presented as a reason for believing another idea. Right? That's what an argument is. So the argument is a whole package of some reasons for believing something. Right? Something that would, some set of ideas that justify you to believe another idea. And this is useful when you're talking to somebody else. It's maybe even more useful when you're trying to think through something yourself. So you present arguments to yourself to decide what you should believe. It gets a lot more complicated when you're trying to convince somebody else of something, but in my life at least, the primary use of arguments has been to convince myself of things or to unconvince myself of things. And this is the basic tool that we're going to spend at least the first half of the course. All of it is going to just be learning this, essentially: argument diagramming. Right? So here is the basic form of an argument diagram. You've got a premise that leads to a conclusion. Right? So the premise or premises are the reason that you should believe the conclusion. So the premise, my legs are itchy, justifies the conclusion that that was poison ivy that I walked through. Right? Okay, so this little arrow is an innocent looking object. It looks real simple, but actually it's this incredibly complex relation. It's the justification relation, right? And if you could say in general what the properties of that little arrow are, you would certainly have completed the project of philosophy, probably also logic, math, a great deal of a bunch of other disciplines as well, because this arrow indicates that this justifies believing that. And in a lot of cases, we have a nice formal account of when you can infer one thing from another, but this class is going to look at the messy, the much larger area where humans mostly roam, where it's not actually super clear. So we're doing a class in informal reasoning. Right? There are lots of systems of formal reasoning. Math is a system of formal reasoning. Logic is a system of formal reasoning. And in those cases where the inferential relation is very, very clear, this arrow is easy. We're going to be dealing with some of that. We are going to talk a little bit about formal argument patterns and when something is clearly justified. But the goal here is to get you comfortable with informal contexts where justification is a lot messier. It's a lot more complex, and you're going to have to be using your common sense and intuition in a very substantial way here, which many people find irritating and upsetting. Common sense, what are you talking about? Anyway, so these argument diagrams, so we're going to spend the first half of the course essentially just learning how to diagram arguments. So we're going to present you with an argument, and you're going to learn how to identify which parts are the premises, which parts are the conclusions, and how the premises are supposed to relate to the conclusions. And this is the simplest possible argument diagram. We'll eventually get to more complex argument diagrams that look kind of like this, where there's a conclusion, and there might be multiple premises related in or I think there are 3 ways in which these premises can be related to a conclusion. They can be these 2 premises, P5 and P6, are jointly necessary to entail C. So they both need to be true in order for that arrow to be valid. And P1 and P2 are sort of independent reasons for believing P3. Don't worry too much about this right now. We will talk about this. You're going to be so sick of argument diagrams. You are going to hate them by the time that we're done this. But this is the skill. I mean, this is the central skill that pretty much everybody agrees is extremely useful for you to have. Yeah, we've got a question.
Is there a chance any of like the diagramming skills you get
from 245? From 2 what?
245.
245. Well,
you know, so like symbolic logic?
yeah. Not really. A little bit. There are a bunch of useful concepts. So the question is your experience in formal symbolic logic going to be useful here? It's definitely great background to have. Like 245 is a really great class to have in combination with this one. It's really useful for things like understanding conditionals. So you've got a huge leg. If you've done 245, you've got a huge leg up understanding conditionals and categorical statements. But this argument diagramming stuff, I don't think this really comes up. I was a TA for 245 for the last year, and this stuff didn't really come up, but it's still useful. Right. So you're going to be doing stuff like this. So the first half of the course is really just learning to see how arguments are structured. We're going to learn how to see past the kind of rhetorical flourishes, the things people put in to make arguments convincing or sound fun or exciting, and just see how the justification is supposed to work, how the structure of justification is supposed to work in an argument. And then the second half, we will shift and start doing evaluating arguments. So once you've got an argument diagram like this, what you can do is say, okay, how good is this inference from P3 to C? How good is that? And we'll talk about the various strategies you can use for assessing the strength of the justification from premises to a conclusion. Right, so first half, just argument diagramming, basically, just learning how to lay out an argument, how to see through the the surface structure to the sort of underlying rational structure of an argument. And in the second half, we'll be doing how do you evaluate the argument. Once you've got it all laid out, how do you tell whether it's a good argument or not? Hi, yeah.
You keep talking about the strength of the argument, so I'm assuming it's not just simple truth or false, right?
That's right, that's right. So it's not, yeah, the strength of an argument is different than simple truth or falsity. So we'll talk about that quite a bit on Monday. The short answer is arguments are not true or false. The only things in the entire universe that can be true or false are statements or beliefs. So each one of these is a statement. P6 is a statement. C is a statement. You could have beliefs that correspond to those statements. But arguments are good or bad. They're either valid or invalid, sound or unsound. This is, again, a place where we're going to grab hold of language that you're extremely familiar with and ask you to use it in a slightly technical way. But it's extremely helpful to keep this distinction between truth and validity or soundness separate. Yeah?
In other words, like, so you can have like an argument that's like really good argument, very strong argument, but it can actually just be complete like nonsense?
That's right. So yes, so you can have an argument that's, so it could be the case that all of these premises and the conclusion are true, or all true statements, but none of the justifications work. Or it could be the case that these are all false, these are all nonsense, but if they were true, then they would justify the conclusion. So this is the distinction between the truth of the premises and the validity or the soundness of the argument. So this is, we're already getting to, this is the content of the course. So we'll start there kind of next time. This time, we're not going to do too much sort of intellectual heavy lifting. Basically what I want to do today is just kind of give you some context and overview for what this class is about, why we're doing this particular class, and go through the syllabus, and that'll be it. It won't be too stressful for you today anyway. So, okay. So, when you think about the word argument, probably what you have in mind is debate. And a debate is the sort of more complex thing than an argument. And a debate is when two people give trade arguments back and forth. So another main goal of this class, once you've learned to lay out the structure of an argument, evaluate it, we're going to, so this is a long-term goal of this class. We're not going to do any live debates, at least until after the midterm. And maybe not even then, because debate brings in this whole really complicated human element to this process, where it's not just about the sort of simple logical relationships between sentences, it's about the fully human, emotional relationship between human beings. Like there's so much more going on in a debate than just the structure of arguments. So we're going to approach that with a great deal of caution if we approach it at all. And only really if you guys are interested, you women and men, are interested in trying some debate. You really have to be sort of willing participants in that because I can't test you on your ability to debate. Really the only things that are going to be on the test and the exam are your ability to do stuff like argument mapping and assessing arguments. I can't test whether you're a generous and compassionate interlocutor on the exam. You'll be relieved to know. So that's a kind of, that stuff is what you need in order to apply this stuff in your real life to bring it to the level of complexity where you're ready to do a debate. So in terms of what you want to get out of this course, I would suggest, you want to be able to get to the debate level of complexity where it's real time, it's two people with different points of view and they're not quite sure what the other person is saying. It's this wildly complex process. And hopefully, at minimum, what this class will do is help you appreciate how complicated it actually is. When you look at what looks like a perfectly simple exchange between two people and try to pick apart the details of it, it's incredibly complex. What we do just sort of spontaneously and naturally. So at minimum, hopefully you'll come away with this with an appreciation of how complex your interactions already are, and how ambiguous and vague language can be, and hopefully, if we're really lucky, how to navigate all that complexity. That's sort of the aspirational goal of this. Yeah?
Would you also be talking about paradoxes and stuff?
Will we be talking about paradoxes? Quite possibly, quite possibly. So there's a lot of room near the end of the course where we can kind of pick and choose what sort of arguments we want to analyze. The first half, we're going to really be doing very simple arguments, but so first half, just laying out the arguments. We'll be doing pretty much just boring argument diagramming exercises. In the second half, we can start dealing with mapping more complex arguments, so mapping some paradoxical arguments towards paradoxes would be good, and arguing about paradoxes would also be good. That's quite possible. We have to more or less take it, play it by ear and sort of see where we get. Every class will be different, so we want to kind of tailor this to what you're interested in and where we get to in the process of learning this stuff. So, yeah. Okay, I propose now to do a little bit of history, and then we'll do what's on the syllabus. None of this is on the test, so kick back, relax. None of the following history. I'm not going to explain any of these concepts deeply enough for you to be able to like use them on the test, but the history of logic is mildly interesting in and of itself, and also sets up a bunch of good context for what it is we're doing here and why. So let's do that now, shall we? So we'll go through ancient Greece, ancient India, ancient China, the Islamic tradition, the Christian tradition, and then the modern symbolic logic. These are kind of all precursors to what we're doing here. So ancient Greece is the typical place to start in this stuff. Often philosophers will tell you that ancient Greece was where logic was invented. That's not so clear to me, but this is a picture of Socrates. It's not relevant what the picture is, so don't worry about it. But ancient Greece was a really interesting place because you have a confluence of at least two things. You have, on the one hand, an attitude towards math and formal reasoning that came from Egypt and Babylonia, which is a kind of almost religious feeling about it. So they thought geometry was a kind of insight into the structure of reality, and they had a quasi-religious relationship with formal reasoning. And they also had some of the first recorded democracies, which means that you can translate being a good talker into political power, right? Previously, if you were living under a tyranny, if you find yourself living under a tyranny, I strongly recommend that you don't make arguments in public. They hate that, right? You will find yourself squished for the crime of trying to argue with people. But in a democracy, it's the exact opposite. You can turn your power to be persuasive into political power, which is something like our society now. You can currently translate being able to make a good argument into getting what you want, some of the time, a little bit. More than not at all, in any case. So this thing I've got here is what's called a syllogism. It's one of the classic argument structures. I think this is from Aristotle. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So these first two things, this has already got a whole bunch. This is the simplest bit of Greek logic. Greek logic is this sprawling, complex thing, but here's the simplest part of it, the classic syllogism. And you already can see a whole bunch of parts of the argument as we'll understand it. So these first two things are premises, and the third thing is a conclusion. And if you believe the first two things, you should definitely believe the third thing, right? If you believe that all men are mortal and you believe Socrates is a man, wow, you should definitely believe that Socrates is mortal, right? The first two things clearly justify the third thing, right? And the Greek innovation, the thing that Greeks were really interested in, not only because they cared about how arguments worked, but because they had this, again, this quasi-religious view of formal reasoning, the thing that got them really excited was that you can strip away the concepts, right? You can strip away the actual ideas that are being talked about and just focus on the form of the argument. So all x's are y's, s is an x, therefore s is a y. I hope you can immediately see that this is a good argument in the sense of being valid, right? So if you believe the first two things, even though you have no idea what s and x are, or what y is, you should believe this third thing if the first two things are true, right? So this is what we've done here is taken away the content of the ideas, and we're left with just the form of the argument, right? So the formal reasoning is essentially this, where we say, okay, what structures are reliable for inferences? Good. So the Greeks were big on that. They loved that stuff. After the rise of the Roman Empire, rich Romans would hire Greek scholars to teach their kids logic, which is what we just saw, and rhetoric. And rhetoric is the art of speaking convincingly. If you've done any philosophy, or if you've sort of read a bit about philosophy, you'll know that there's this quite acrimonious debate between philosophers and what was called sophists. So the sophists were guys who would teach your children how to speak convincingly, how to make a really good case in the Senate, how to make people believe what you want them to believe. And the sophists didn't really care that much about whether what you were trying to convince people of was true, strictly speaking. They prided themselves on being able to, so a classic sophist move would be to give a rousing speech for one proposition on a Thursday, and on a Friday give a rousing speech for the opposite proposition, to show how they could make a convincing case for whatever they wanted. And philosophers hated this, of course. Philosophers thought you should only ever sort of struggle after the truth. And so we have this distinction between logic, which is about what inferences are justified, and rhetoric, which is what kind of speaking is persuasive. So you might be mildly disappointed to find out that we're going to focus much more on logic than rhetoric here. We're going to not spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out how to persuade people despite their best interests or despite what's actually true. We're going to focus on how to make reliable inferences, which arguments are reliably truth tracking or something like that. Okay, so much for the Greeks. So the Greeks were by far not the only ancient culture, to have a tradition like this, however. So ancient India was also a place where there was a lot of debate going on. So there's a huge variety of different schools of philosophy in ancient India, and they would have, so the different schools of philosophy each had their own account of what makes an argument a good one. And they would subscribe to some or most or like different combinations of these 6 pramanas, I guess, pramanas. I'm sorry, I've only ever read this word. I didn't get to do any classes on Indian philosophy. These 6 pramanas are, does anybody know how that's properly said? Okay, well then nobody can contradict me. Okay, so each one of these are reasons for believing a premise, right? So you don't want to just know that your premises lead to your conclusion. You also want to know that your premises are true. So these are means of justification. So you might believe a thing because you saw it, you perceived it. You might believe the thing because it's the result of a valid inference. You might believe a thing because it stands in an appropriate comparison or analogy. We'll do a little bit of it on analogical arguments. You might believe something because it's been derived from circumstances. That is, you can tell from the way things are as a matter of fact. You can tell that something is true because you saw something, you have a negative proof, so you saw where something should have been. Like, I'm pretty confident that no aliens have visited Earth because there's never been a reliable report of aliens visiting Earth. So that's a non-perception. And of course, testimony, which modern people get really uncomfortable when you tell them testimony is a source of knowledge, but I believe a bunch of scientific facts, and I have confirmed almost none of them myself. I think I did one experiment in high school where we measured absolute zero. It came out to like -200 and something. That was about as accurate as it got. But I believe all the science because scientists told me so. So the testimony of reliable people is one pramana. All right, so these are different reasons for believing, and the different schools of Indian philosophy would accept different ones. So the Caravaka, for example, only believed, there's a skeptical school of Indian philosophy called Caravaka. They only thought perception, I believe, was a valid source of knowledge. They had different stories about which of these are valid sources of knowledge. There's a really great school called the NYAYA school. And the NYAYA's got what looks a lot like, so people have argued whether this looks more like a syllogism or a style of explanation, but they gave an abstract formula for when is an inference reliable, and it goes something like this. He says, there's a thesis, so for example, this is the absolute classic example, there's fire on the hill, and you give a reason, because there is smoke on the hill. So the fire on the hill is sort of the conclusion, and then they give you a reason for that conclusion, because there's smoke, and a rule which justifies the connection between the premise and the conclusion. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire, like a kitchen hearth and unlike a lake. So you also give an example, and then you apply the rule, the hill is likewise smoky, thus there is fire on the hill, conclusion. So the idea was that you could substitute in a bunch of different things, different rules, observations, and such like, and this was a sort of abstract formula that would tell you when an inference is reliable. Okay, so much for ancient India. This is going to be a whirlwind tour, by the way. Pardon me. Okay, so ancient China had some of this stuff. Not, as far as I can tell, as much focus on this as ancient Greece or ancient India. Confucius was very interested in what he called the rectification of names, also the legalist school of Chinese philosophy, very interested in the rectification of names, which more or less just means using words properly, using words in the right way, getting the reference of words matched up properly with their meaning. So mothers should act like mothers, kids should act like kids, leaders should act like leaders, that the names should match up properly with reality. Okay, so that's kind of like this. It's not very much like this. Something that's much more like what we're going to be doing is the Moist 3 Fa, the 3 standards. So this was supposed to be, the Moists were warring states, or 100 schools period, so like 500 BC to 200 BC or so. And they tried to produce this system that anybody could use to check whether something is true. And the rule was this: they had the 3 standards, 3 things that you should check: the root, the source, and the use. So the root was like the pramana of testimony, so there should be some story from the sort of tales of usually the ancient emperors. So there's a lot of stories about ancient sage emperors who would be morally perfect. So you would find a root for something. If you say, well, the yellow emperor acted like this, that would be the root, right? There would be a source. So you need some way of checking whether something is true, like empirical evidence would be a source for the information, right? And a use. So they also thought that the idea should be useful for something in your life. It shouldn't just be an idle thought. That one of the ways of checking whether something is a reliable idea is to see that it had some practical application. Okay, so there's that. This was not, though, a particularly prominent strain in Chinese philosophy, and I would like to suggest one reason that might be so. A much more prominent strain in Chinese philosophy was the Taoist tradition. And the Taoist tradition was deeply, deeply skeptical of essentially what we're going to be doing in this class and what they do much more in 245, which is the formal rules of reasoning. And I would like to really briefly tell you an anecdote from the Shuangzi, which is the second most important Taoist text after the Lao Tzu. So the story of Du Quan and Wheelwright Pian. So really quickly, this is from the Shuangzi. Du Quan was reading a book in the hall. Wheelwright Pian, who had been chiseling a wheel in the courtyard below, so it's a guy who makes wheels, set down his tools and climbed the stairs to ask Du Quan, "May I ask, what words are in the book your grace is reading?" The classic of a famous sage, the Duke responded. Is he still alive? Oh no, he's long dead. Well then, you're reading the dregs left over by a dead man, aren't you? Duke Huan said, how dare a wheelwright to have opinions about the book I read? If you can explain yourself, I'll let it pass. Otherwise, it's death. Wheelwright Pian said, in my case, I see things in terms of my own work. I chisel at a wheel. If I go too slow, the chisel slides and does not stay put. If I hurry, it jams and does not move properly. When it is just right, I can feel it in my hand and respond to it from my heart. I can explain this to my son, but I cannot pass the skills to him. That is why at 70 years old, I am still making wheels. The sage who couldn't pass down his wisdom is already dead, and that's why I say the book you're reading is merely the dregs of a dead man. So this is a really profound skepticism about what book learning can teach you. That's the end of the story, by the way. It didn't say whether he got killed or not. Really cheeky, right, of Wheelwright Pian. So the moral of that story, I think, is supposed to be that there's a kind of living, intuitive essence of a lot of the things that you do. Like you can tell somebody how to ride a bicycle, but that doesn't mean that they can ride the bicycle, right? They have to learn the skill themselves, even after you've told them what to do, basically. They have to actually go through the process of learning. So this story is just meant to highlight that in a really vivid way, that much of the world can be reduced down to formulas that can be applied mindlessly, but a great deal of the world cannot. Right? So this kind of deep skepticism about trying to reduce the world down to simple formulas deeply ran through Chinese philosophy, and I suspect that's why you don't see much emphasis on formal reasoning. So I'd like you to keep this in mind, although it's a bit more radical of a position than the one I hope to develop in this course with you. I think there's a more balanced picture presented by the philosopher of probability De Finetti, who says the following. The tendency to overestimate reason, often in an exclusive spirit, is particularly harmful. Reason, to my mind, is invaluable as a supplement to the other psychointuitive faculties, but never a substitute for them. Figuratively, reason is a pole that may keep the plant of intuitive thought from growing crooked, but it is not itself either a plant or a valid substitute for a plant. Right? So in this class, we'll be working on the bean pole a little bit. We'll be giving you some of the formal tools that you can use to, when they happen to fit, it's great. When the formal tools of reasoning happen to fit the situation that you're in nicely, it's a wonderful thing because you can very easily and reliably say, aha, this is definitely justified. But the bean pole is neither the bean plant nor a substitute for the bean plant. And in this class, hopefully, we'll be developing both. We'll be developing the relationship between the two. Because you're going to be dealing with the wild and woolly world of informal reasoning, not just formal reasoning. Okay, so moving on, we're going to leap historically. This is a grand historical leap of a 1,500 years or so to early Islam, where in the Abbasid Caliphate, so this is, I'm sorry, you can barely see this picture, but so here's the caliphate at the death of Muhammad, and then here it is I think it's not even like a couple centuries later in the Abbasid Caliphate. This wild expansion of the Islamic Empire. And so they had this problem. They had the same problem that they had in the ancient Indian milieu, and they had the same problem that they had in the ancient Greek milieu, which is people with a whole bunch of different ideas were suddenly thrown together in this political unity. And they needed some strategy for dealing with that. So two strategies that were emerged. One was Kalam, which is a kind of theological system of debate. So Kalam was the rules of how to argue in favor of Islam. And it was relatively restricted in who got to learn it. So it wasn't considered a good idea for absolutely everybody to learn the rules of Kalam, because that was just sort of engaging you in debates that might shake your faith unnecessarily. But there also emerged the falsafa, which is a sort of borrowed word borrowed from philosopher, They were pulling in a whole bunch of texts from all over the place, a bunch of variety of different philosophical texts, and the falsifa tradition sort of developed the logic that Aristotle had started, the Greeks, like Aristotle and Plato, further than it had been developed before. So they developed novel forms of syllogisms. Remember that Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So there's a bunch of different varieties of that in Aristotle, and they did develop even newer varieties of that in Kalam. So for example, the conditional syllogism. If I do not wake up, then I cannot go to work. If I cannot go to work, then I will not get paid. Therefore, if I do not wake up, then I will not get paid. It's sort of series of conditionals. We'll talk about conditionals later. And furthermore, they developed what are called modal syllogisms, syllogisms that relate to necessity and possibility. So every laughing thing is necessarily a man, therefore some men are possibly laughing. So you can see this is a different sort of inference than the categorical syllogism that you saw before. So Kalam and falsifa are developing logic sort of further than the Greeks had. Okay, really a whirlwind tour here. The medieval Christian tradition. So if you were getting educated in the sort of medieval Christian world, you would first learn what's called the trivium and then the quadrivium. So the trivium was grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium was music, arithmetic, astronomy, and geometry. So the logic that they were learning was scholastic philosophy, and if you've ever heard of scholastic philosophy, that's kind of used as a way of, if you call somebody scholastic, what you mean is that they're making the most annoyingly tiny distinctions between things, and you're being really boring and nitpicky. So I won't bore you. But by this point, logic is so complicated and nitpicky that you don't even want to. I don't know. It's wonderful. You should study medieval philosophy. But that's not what we're doing. So, okay, that brings us to modern symbolic logic. So in the late 1800s, pretty much the turn of the 1800s, Gottlob Frege and a bunch of other people started developing what's called modern symbolic logic. And this was, the idea was we're going to sweep away the weird complexities of scholastic philosophy and replace it with something perfectly rigorous, something perfectly clear and kind of mathematical. So here's an example. This is an example straight out of PHL247 where you can currently learn philosophy or modern symbolic logic. So this thing here says, although not all sandwiches are tasty, some of the ones with pickles are. So again, none of this is on the test. I'm not actually teaching you this. I just want to kind of show you this as a contrast to what we're doing. So this is not all x. So it's not the case that for all x, if x is a G, then x is an A, where G has pickles, A is tasty. And there exists an x such that x is a G, and x is a C, and x is an A. Hooray. Okay, so, and here's what a deduction in modern symbolic logic looks like. This is, again, taken straight out of PHL245. It's much less scary than it looks when you're just sort of looking at it raw. But so each of these are a rule of inference that's perfectly well justified. Like each of these rules is completely reliable, never fails you. And to go from one line to the next, you say which rule you're using. And the idea here is that you start with these premises on the left and then deduce the conclusion on the right, and then you've derived the conclusion. Okay, so this is the heart of the beanpole. This is the heart of proper deductive logic, formal deductive logic. This is not the class to learn that properly. The place to learn that is PHL245. There's wonderful classes on that, super interesting. But this particular inference, I don't know if that's ever come up in my life that I needed to know that thing. Probably less practically helpful, unless of course you're a computer programmer. If you're a computer programmer, this stuff is super duper useful and you'll probably use it regularly, or a mathematician. Literally all of the rest of us probably don't need deductive tools as elaborate and formal as this. What you need is something more like informal logic. So, and that's, of course, what we're going to do here. So if you recall, I mean, the medieval Christian thing, they would teach you grammar, logic, and rhetoric sort of as part of your general education. They didn't just teach this to philosophers or logicians. They would teach you this as a just to get you geared up to be a citizen, an educated citizen, a rich educated citizen, of course. But so the tradition had it that everybody would learn some logic, but now logic looks like this. And it's probably not as practically useful for most people as it should be, or it's not what you really want. So this whole tradition of informal logic developed. These are a tiny sample of the, I Googled critical reasoning text. There's dozens and dozens of these things. Like, it started in about the 1970s, so as logic became more and more complex and kind of rigorous and serious, it became apparent that it wasn't doing the job that most people wanted it to do, which was to just help you figure out how to navigate the kind of arguments and debates you'll find in your actual life. So this class is in this tradition. And there's just dozens of these things. There's dozens of them. They differ in their details. The overall shape of it is pretty much the same in any of these. You'll get the same basic sort of skills. And they differ in sort of small-ish ways. All right. And the one we're going to be using is this one, Critical Thinking, An Introduction to the Basic Skills. I believe this should be at the UTM bookstore now. Has anybody seen it? I'm seeing nods. So yes, okay, so it is in the bookstore. Go get it. It's a great text. It's clear. It's straightforward. It's Canadian. So all the examples are Canadian. So I really like this text. It's very useful. You should buy it. Okay. All right. So that's okay, that was the whirlwind overview. Question, yeah?
Would you be fine if we have an older version of it?
I think, so yes, I think you would be fine to have an older version of it. I don't know how much of it has actually changed. So we're going to be drawing some examples from it, but you're not going to be, I'm never going to say to you, do all the exercises on this page or anything like that. Probably it would be okay to have an older version. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. we're just gonna basically go through the syllabus now. Do you feel like you want a break before we go through the syllabus, or are you good to go? There's not that much more to go, really. Okay. Okay, so here's the breakdown of the marking. You'll probably be sad to see attendance on there. I'm not taking attendance today, partly because I hadn't announced that beforehand. So if somebody didn't make it today, they'll be sad that they're already behind in the course. So we'll start taking attendance next week. There will be 3 online quizzes. These are fairly straightforward, and you'll be allowed to take them as many times as you want. So they shouldn't be any kind of deep difficulty. I expect the average on that one to be very high. There'll be 1 term test that may or may not be in this room. I think we could be okay in this room, but we'll decide as we get closer. You'll do 1 written formal argument analysis, and then there's an exam. So in terms of attendance, you actually do need to show up to class most of the time. I do actually need you to show up. Oh, good. The sun is kind of setting, so you can see the screen now. That's nice. OK, so I will be taking attendance, but you can miss up to 2 classes, not including this one, with no explanation and no penalty. Right? So that's, for a summer course, that's like 20% of the course that you can just blow off without any problem. So hopefully that's helpful. Doctor's notes or other official documentation can excuse further absences than that. And after that, I'll start taking off attendance marks sort of proportionate to the number of classes missed. That's necessary, at least part because I'm going to try to put as much of the course as I can online. So I'm currently recording myself, and I'm going to put that up on the Blackboard. So partly I don't want you to all just disappear. I don't want to be lecturing to an empty room while you all just listen to it online. That's for my benefit, but for your benefit, the plan is mostly to do me talking for a little bit at the beginning of the class to just introduce the ideas, and then we'll do exercises. So I'll hand out sheets. You'll work away on the exercises by yourself in pairs or in small groups, whatever you please. And then we'll come back together after that and talk about the exercises. So you actually need to be here to sort of participate in that process. And you also, if we get to the point where you're all comfortable with argument diagramming, where we can actually do some real-time-ish debates, you also need to be physically present for that part. So for those reasons, we decided it was advisable to take attendance. If you can just show up, it's the easiest 12% you'll get all year. So yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not a question about attendance.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
But it's just that this is a later class.
Yeah.
So I come straight from work.
Okay.
Is it okay if we eat in class or no?
I think it's perfectly fine by me. If anybody has worries about people eating in class, maybe email me, and I probably you don't want to like tell. What's your name?
Andrea?
Andrea. You probably don't want to tell Andrea right now that she's a bad person for eating in class, but you can tell me, and I'll tell her for you if that's all right. But it's perfectly fine for me if you don't, especially if you don't bring like a fish curry. That's something that's very odoriferous. But yeah, that's fine for me. Any other kind of procedural questions like that? Okay, good. Okay. Yes, so there will be 3 online quizzes on Blackboard. The due dates are on the syllabus. You can take these quizzes as many times as you like up until the due date. And hopefully they'll be the kind of quizzes or the kind of questions that you'll find on the midterm and the exam. So mostly those are just for me to signal to you what kind of problems you'll be facing on the midterm and the final exam. It's also to kind of give you something to stay on track with, sort of like get a little bit of feedback as you go along. I don't expect them to be too terribly taxing. You shouldn't be sort of staying up you won't be pulling all-nighters to get these done, but they're only 6% as well. So, all right, the big written analysis, the big written project. Sorry, the question, yeah.
When will the written quizzes the online quizzes be available?
So I hope to post the first one before Monday's class next week. And I'll post them kind of like 1 week, at least 1 week in advance of when they're due. Partly I don't want to post them way in advance because I haven't written them yet, and partly so that you don't just, I mean, to be probably too frank, those quizzes are going to be super easy to cheat on. So one person could figure out the answers and just tell everybody else. So I'm trying to make that less appealing to you. Don't do that. You're paying for this education, or somebody's paying for you to be here, and it's not that hard. You get as many chances as you want. The stakes are low, so don't cheat. Come on. All right. That was my rhetoric. I'm sorry. That's why I'm not teaching you rhetoric. Come on. All right. So this one is going to be work, though. This argument analysis is going to be a written assignment. What I'll do is I'll post an argument on Blackboard, 400 words or something, 400 or 500 words, and you're going to analyze it. You're going to break it down into conclusion and premises. You're going to diagram the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, and then you're going to tell me how good the argument is. So it's argument analysis. We're going to talk a lot about how to do this in class. The plan is to do a bunch of exercises in this, so it will be a totally familiar process to you. And furthermore, if you submit a draft to me on or before August 4th, which is 1 week before the due date, I'll give you feedback on it. Yeah?
So, like, in my mind, I'm seeing, like, you said like 400 or 500 word, like, argument, and we're going to analyze. So, like, are the practice, like, so we're going to have, like, practice for that, presumably?
Yes, you are.
Is that going to be, like, 100 words argument, and we, like, do it like a mini scale version of that?
Right. So the argument analysis is going to be on a fairly complex kind of real-world style argument. Everything we're going to do in the first half of the course will be short, simple stuff. So the plan is to just gradually ramp up the complexity of the arguments that you're analyzing as the course goes on. So this is the very last one. This will be at the maximum level of complexity that we'll ask you to deal with. It's not that complex. It's not like 600 pages of Kant or anything. It'll be something fairly short, but still quite complex compared to where we'll start. Like we're going to start with all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Very short, compact, clear arguments, and then we'll gradually ramp it up. I see a question here. Yeah.
Can we submit multiple drafts?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, the last draft has to be in before August 4th, but up until then, yeah. Okay, so can you submit multiple drafts? Yes, I think so. Very few of you will choose to do that. I'm going on past relatively few of you, a goodly number of you, but not all of you will choose to do this. Very few of you will do like multiple drafts beforehand, but good on those of you who do. Okay. All right, so getting in touch with me, this is my email address, corey.lewis@utoronto.ca. I have the ancient archaic form of the utoronto email because I've been here for so very long. I started here as an undergrad in September of 2000, which means that next year the university will be admitting students that were born the year I started at U of T. That's disturbing to me, deeply disturbing to me. At least I'm not a student. I just finished my PhD. I defended my PhD on June 21st. So at least I'm not a student with these people who were born when I started. But please include PHL247 in the subject. I'm also teaching a course, a different course called HPS 200 this semester. So if you just say, I hate this course, I won't know which course you're talking about. I will do my very best to respond within 48 hours to any email. If I fail to do so, and I have not always succeeded in my attempts here, if I fail to do so, please email me again. You're not bugging me, I have failed you, and you're reminding me of my duties. Okay? Meetings and office hours, I'm very happy to meet with you, but I'm usually only on campus the day when we have class, so the ideal time for me to meet with you would be either just before or just after class. Please just make an appointment, and either of the days of class should be fine to meet up. I believe I have an office in the philosophy department, which is that. Does everybody know where the philosophy department is? It's right near the bus stop. It's like a 2-story kind of portable-looking thing. You'll find it. You can check online. All right. So just quickly to go through what we're going to do day by day. July 5th. That's this. Oh, good. It's really, you can really see the screen now. This is great. July 10th, we'll do formal and informal reasoning, which is sort of the very basics of this stuff. We'll do soundness, validity, truth, premises, conclusion, and so on. July 12th, we'll do meanings and definitions, so clarifying the meaning of concepts, developing definitions. And then July 13th will be the first quiz. July 17th will be about clarifying the meaning of sentences rather than just words. July 19th will be about reconstructing arguments. And that brings us up to the first term test, which will be during class time. So instead of class, we'll have a term test, which should be about an hour. I think it won't be more than an hour. Right. And all of that is going to be fairly boring argument diagramming stuff. For some of you, you'll experience that as so trivially easy that you can't believe that you're getting course credit for it. For some of you, this will be torture. This will be unbelievably weird and counterintuitive and hard. So I hope that both groups of you and everybody in between sticks with it. The psychology literature suggests that it's worth your time. People who do this kind of stuff do better on standardized tests like the GMAT and the LSAT. So hopefully that's worth your while. So then we move on to the second half, strategies for assessing arguments. This is where we start going beyond just trying to figure out what the structure of the argument is and into deciding whether it's a good argument or not. And this is where, again, the first half we're dealing with relatively simple questions. The second half, it gets weirder and more, not weirder, it gets more ambiguous. We'll be dealing with the vagaries of language in a more serious way, the vagaries of inference and induction in a more serious way. So 31st is assessing truth claims, trying to decide whether a premise is true or not. August 2nd, we're going to do entire class on normative and descriptive claims, because I was a TA for this class last semester, and none of the students knew the difference between normative and descriptive claims at the end of the semester. So we're going to do a whole lecture on just the difference between is and ought. So it is the case that it's hot and sunny out, therefore you ought to hydrate well, or something like that. You can't just go from a descriptive claim to a normative claim without some other intervening thing. So anyway, we'll talk lots about that. Second quiz due on the 4th. There's no class on the 7th, it's a civic holiday. And then we'll do assessing relevance, adequacy, and the 15th is a makeup Monday. So that's the only one. All of these are Mondays or Wednesdays, except for August 15th. Because the semester started on Tuesday of this week, we didn't have a class on Monday. So the 15th is a makeup Monday. And we're really just going to do summary and review. So a question here.
For the August 2nd optional reading, is it inquiry?
Is it what?
Is it the inquiry from Hume?
The question was, is the optional reading David Hume's inquiry into human understanding? It could be. It could be. I haven't really decided yet, actually. Right. So that was the joke is that Hume advances this what's called Hume's law that says you can't get an ought from an is. I think that's what you're referring to. Good. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you're ahead of the curve on that one. Probably we're not going to, the inquiry is like several hundred pages long, so probably not going to read that, but we'll read something about normativity then. Yeah?
So when in the timeline of the course so you can actually give us the argument that we're going to do the analysis on?
Yes, that is an excellent question to which, to be honest, I have not yet quite worked out the answer. After the midterm, but I think that I shouldn't give it to you any later than the 4th. So let's say the 4th is my deadline for posting that. The thing that you're going to write for us is not going to be more than sort of 3 to 5 pages or something like that. You're not going to be writing a 40-page treatise on this argument. So it's not that it is going to be like a months and months of heavy research and sweating and something like that. You do need to have the vocabulary that we're going to develop in this course sort of down pat before you write it. So it's probably better not to get started on it like now, because what I want is to give you a bunch of terms that we're going to use in this very specific senses here. So like argument is going to be used in a very specific sense. Validity is going to be used in a very specific sense. Truth is going to be used in a very specific sense. And the TA, who's his name is Michael, he's a good friend of mine, will be looking to see that you're using those terms in the way that we use them in this course. So if you're using these terms in the way that they make sense, like in the rest of the world, that's sort of evidence for Michael that you didn't quite get the exact terms that we wanted you to learn for the sake of this course. So probably better not to dive into that process too early, but yeah, I feel like August 4th should be the day that by that time I should have posted it. These summer courses go really fast. So yeah. Okay. We talked all about this pre and post midterm exercises. So yeah, the structure of the class should be, in general, it should be me talk for a while, hopefully not too long, and then we'll have a break. We'll hand out exercises that you'll all do. So please do bring a pen or pencil to the next class because you'll be writing on paper. And then we'll review the answers to that. Once we get to the second half of the course, that structure might change a little bit. So we'll do me talk for a little while, maybe some quick exercises, and then something a little different, possibly debate, possibly, so one thing that we can get started on, or that you can get started on, is looking for arguments for us to analyze. So last semester we did a bunch of editorials from the newspaper, and I feel like a lot of students just had never read editorials from the newspaper, because who reads newspapers? So they weren't really familiar with the format that they were looking at. So perhaps a better idea would be to analyze arguments from social media. So if you see a nice, compact, back and forth debate on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit or Tumblr or wherever you frequent, perhaps send me an anonymized version of it. So you gotta get rid of the names. I'm not gonna put a bunch of real people's names on this screen for us to pick apart their words. But so if you want to send me arguments that you'd like to analyze, and once we get into this, you'll see what kind of arguments will be appropriate. We can pick apart, so a back and forth, maybe 3 or 4 back and forths on Facebook, and we can try to identify what's the conclusion that this person is arguing for. What are the premises that they're bringing to bear? Are they justified? Are they unjustified? So picking apart Facebook arguments would be a great activity for applying this stuff in a context that you're more likely to actually see it. Did I see a hand here?
My question is about the argument analysis. So
Yeah.
when you were showing the derivation,
Yeah.
Is that kind of like what you would want us to do? Well, obviously not the symbolic logic, but like that argument, like derivation was kind of like labeled as what's going on. That's kind of what you want us to do with the argument?
I mean, if you could get it that precise, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. Really, what I'm hoping that you'll produce is an argument diagram. So if you recall this thing. So this is the kind of map that I'd like you to produce. So you'll take a 400, 500 word thing. You'll strike out the irrelevant parts, or the parts that aren't actually part of the argument. You'll identify the premises and how they relate to the conclusion. And that'll be the sort of analysis part. Well, that'll be the breakdown part of the argument analysis. So you'll be producing an argument map of kind of this sort of thing, and with an associated commentary on, the inference from P3 to C is not as strong as it could be, that kind of thing. So this is more or less the product of your formal analysis, plus the commentary that explains it. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
So, but would you be writing it like an essay, or like it's constantly a formal?
Something between an essay and bullet points. It doesn't have to have an elaborate introduction. Since the dawn of time, humans have wondered whether their arguments are valid. But you do have to use paragraphs, and so we'll talk more about the structure as it gets to it. It won't be as essay-ish as some essays, but I also don't want to see just bullet points and no capitalization or no grammar and stuff like that. So yeah. Further questions? Okay, great. Well, then I will see you on Monday.